All right, we are continuing on with linkage institutions, and we look at the game board here, and I just want to point out that technically we're still in linkage institutions because the media that we're going to look at today is still going to serve that function of connecting the people with the government. In the United States, our media is more or less private, and therefore it is a non-governmental voice. It is more or less the voice of the people or private institutions. And so therefore we're still in linkage institutions, but when we get to the media, we have to understand that the media serves a very specific function, and that is also, in addition to being a linkage institution, it also serves as the agenda setter, or it fulfills the agenda setting function. Because the media is so much more powerful than, say, a person's vote or a group's vote, because just by putting something on the news, now we have the entire country seeing something or hearing about an issue. And so it is in many ways incredibly powerful in getting the policymakers to hear about a certain issue that's being debated in the public. So therefore we kind of set it out and give it a special status at this stage in the policymaking system. So we're going to talk quickly about the development of media politics. So we can go all the way back to the 1920s and 30s when radio comes along, and it really changes the ballgame because now a president like FDR, who's kind of the first one to use the media effectively, through the fireside chats, and he can directly use the media from the top down to the people. And so this is a lesson right off the bat that the media is going to serve a function for the government as well as for the people. In other words, it goes up and it goes down too, as far as information traveling from one to the other. Until the 1960s, it was really just a medium for for the government to inform the public on certain issues. And then in the 1960s, things changed because now we got TV. And TV obviously gives us visuals instead of just audio. And that gives us a much more vivid and powerful picture. And so, something like Vietnam, where we get the beginnings of investigative journalism, where we have journalists on the ground showing us what's happening in the war and giving us their interpretation, which wasn't always accurate, but nonetheless it was given to a believing public. And so now what we have is the beginnings of the media helping to shape public opinion. And so we talked earlier about political socialization and how the media serves a big role in shaping people's opinions. So there's that also. And of course, what I also said, which is the biggest thing, is that the media also is going to expose issues and force the policymakers to address them. And we see that beginning with Vietnam and Watergate. For example, we say the Vietnam is a quagmire, it's an unwinnable war. These are the things that the media starts to say, and that puts pressure on the policymakers to pull the troops out of the war. But before that happened, it was the media reporting on these things, and then getting the electorate riled up on the issue, and then forcing policymakers to make a decision on as far as policy. And so early on, that was a rarity, this investigative journalism. That's the beginning. Because still in the 1960s, 90% of newspaper stories were descriptive. But what we could see coming around the corner with Vietnam and Watergate was that in the future, by the time we get to the 90s, 80% of the news stories were now attacks, or they were partisan stories attempting to either discredit or praise a certain policymaker. And so this is the beginning of what we call, among other things, a biased media. So what we need to realize is that the media is never impartial. We've talked about public opinion and ideology, and we have to understand that the media falls right into that system. They play for teams as well. In other words, there are liberal-leaning media outlets and there are conservative-leaning media outlets. So I talked already about the agenda setting function. So we've learned already that when people in groups have disputes, those problems become issues, and they attempt to make their position known by having a louder voice through joining groups, and doing all the things that groups do, electioneering, petitioning, and whatnot, engaging the political process. The media does this as well, but it does it in a huge and specific way. When they report on an issue, then people know something is happening. The rest of the country that's not necessarily directly involved in that dispute. And so there's lots of examples we can give, but the bottom line is it's not a political issue unless people know about it. And you can have all the rallies you want, you can cast all the votes you want, you can make all the contributions you want, you could even do civil disobedience all that you want, break the law and do all these things. But if nobody knows, then nothing happened. And that's what the media does, is once they report on something, then everybody knows about it, and now the policymakers cannot ignore these things. They have to address these issues. So I want to run down a couple of the different types of media that we've had and still have today. Newspapers go all the way back to the 19th century, and right away newspapers, from the get-go, are going to be political. You go back to even before this, where we have, in the colonial period and the revolutionary period, we see newspapers devoted to one side or the other. And you may recall that the Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson fight. And they would smear each other through the newspapers because there was a Jefferson paper and then there was a Hamilton paper. And that's been something that's been with us all along. And we can criticize the papers these days for being too political or being too nasty. And the fact is, it's been with us from the very beginning. And we saw with Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst in the context of the yellow journalism of the Spanish-American War, drumming up issues which led to war. And we've seen it at other times too, with the Civil War and the slavery issue and North versus South, all the way up through Watergate, as we've mentioned. Every major metropolitan area in the country is going to have a reputable newspaper. New York Times, Washington Post. You've heard these names over time. And there's also the Associated Press, which is not necessarily a paper in itself, but it's a news service, which means they write stories, and then newspapers around the country will purchase their stories and put them in their papers. So in other words, they reprint their stories or reprinted in other papers. And of course, newspapers over the last generation have been dying out in their print form. And it used to be that everybody had the paper delivered to them every day, or at least on the weekends, and you would pay 25, 50 cents for your paper. And then, as we moved into the digital age, newspapers are going to start making their money not necessarily on subscriptions, because you can go on the NewYorkTimes.com and read stories for free. And now how they make money is through advertisements on their website. So when you go and read the news on NewYorkTimes.com, then you're going to see ads, and that ad space is sold for a profit. And so we'll talk more about newspapers and their ideology in a moment. Same thing with magazines. They're really kind of in the same position as newspapers. Their readership is fading, and you get people who are aware of politics, people that are more educated. They're still going to read magazines, and there's magazines for different persuasions and different interests. And there are conservative magazines like the National Review and the Weekly Standard, and then there's more liberal magazines like Time Magazine and U.S. News and World Report and things like that. So more or less today, political magazines are read by the educational elite or the intellectual elites, and people who desire to be heavily informed on politics. The broadcast media, we've heard the term broadcast a lot in our lives, and maybe that's one of these terms that you never really stopped and thought about too much. But basically what the broadcast media means is that it's cast to a broad audience, and with the assumption that lots of different kinds of people are going to be tuning in to one big broadcast. So when we say broadcast, we're talking about radio, which for the longest time, radio wasn't really specified to different tastes. Like today, we have radio stations for all different kinds of music. We got radio stations for religious people. We've got radio stations that are in English and Spanish. We've got sports radio. We got talk radio, and so on and so forth. Um, and by and large, radio was a medium where you're going to have a pretty mainstream source of news, and then you're going to have a couple of stations for music. So this has kind of changed. Radio isn't as much of a broadcast as it used to be, but it would still be considered broadcast. And then TV, but only over-the-air TV. So PBS, NBC, ABC, and CBS, and then a couple others depending on where you are. And when TV appears in the 50s and 60s, nobody has cable, nobody's got internet, and so you have millions of people watching just these 4 networks, or at any one time when they came along. And so therefore they had to have a broad cast of something that all these different kinds of people are going to like, or at least tune into. So you're going to have family-safe programming. You're not going to have things that are inappropriate for kids. You're going to have mainly mainstream news, or seemingly mainstream news. And so, and as time goes by, as I've mentioned, TV has kind of shifted into more of a slant, depending on which one you're showing. And so TV has been huge from day one, and it was pretty staggering back in the 60s. In 1960, it was 1 out of 10 families had a TV, and then by 1959, 8 out of 10 had TVs. And so it really changes the world in many ways, for good and for bad. TV has been detrimental in many ways when it comes to politics and government and things like that. Because sometimes it shows us things that we don't like, but they may be necessary things. And the way the public is today, something like wars, we hear about a lot of American soldiers dying, or we get visuals of explosions and villages being bombed. This has always been the nature of war, and sometimes people will argue that wars need to be fought. And if the people don't like it, though, if they see it, and so something that people for thousands and thousands of years have never seen war, but now they can, and they realize how horrible it is. So it's a lot harder for a government to fight a war that needs to be fought. And so TV does lots of things in politics. Now, the narrowcast, this is a term that hasn't necessarily caught on quite as much as broadcast, but obviously this refers to mediums that are going to be catered to a specific audience. And so what we want to point to here is the internet. Internet these days, obviously a huge source of news, and there's a couple little dynamics to it. If it's a narrowcast, that means you can find whatever kind of news you want to find. Not only left-wing news or right-wing news, but you can find young people news, you can find old people news, you can find news catered to a specific race, you can find news catered to a specific region, and on and on and on. And obviously social media is going to play a role here with Facebook and Twitter and blogs and things like that. But this takes us to a newer phenomenon that's been around this last generation, and that is there's far more news than we've ever had before. Huge supply of news, but it is less reliable than ever, because now you and I, normal human beings, can put up news. You can put a Twitter out and claim certain things, but it doesn't. There's very few controls on what is true and what is reliable, and so that's kind of where we are today with the reliability of news. And obviously the younger generation and more people who are tech savvy are going to get their news from the web, but they don't necessarily have the skills to differentiate between what is reliable and what is not reliable. And so, and one of the phenomenon that we've realized is, even in this technological age where we have so much information at our disposal, the internet and computers and all this information is such a potential blessing for humankind, but it hasn't translated into more political awareness. And you know why? Because even though we have this capability of becoming better educated and more informed on the issues. People don't necessarily want to do that. They'd rather play games or chat on, uh, on social media or check their Facebook and Twitters. And so it hasn't translated into more political awareness, and that's unfortunate. In fact, you could even argue it's been detrimental. It actually has decreased our awareness of politics because now people have more distractions than they used to. Cable TV is also a narrowcast because if you go to cable news, unlike broadcast news, which is supposed to be kind of down the middle, that's safe for everybody, you go over to cable news, and now you've got news that's going to be catered for specific interests. And I'll talk about what those are in a moment. And so we get to another phenomenon here where we have more reliable news as far as events and information, but you're also going to have a lot of commentary on cable news. And you've seen it before where you go on, you have two people talking to each other via satellite with two sub pictures on your screen, and they're basically yelling at each other. And then sometimes they got three, sometimes they got four people talking at the same time. And it becomes very opinionated. And so what we need to realize about cable TV news is that it may be more reliable as far as information, but the analysis and the punditry and the spin on these kinds of things are going to be very much slanted toward one type of audience. Whatever network you find yourself on, it's going to be slanted to your liking. That's why you're watching. And that takes us to a bigger issue, which is we have to understand that not only is the media not impartial and that they are definitely trying to persuade you of something, they're also a business. Unless they make themselves relatively entertaining, you're not going to watch. And so they're providing a service, but they're also a business. And so they I think more so than their function as the agenda setter and their political role. They need to make money. And so this is where we see the news get sensationalized. This is why they love throwing people up there to bicker at each other, because it's entertaining. That's why we love to, news agencies love to put the bad news up there where, people are just in shock about the newest terrorist attack, or in shock about this person who's murdered 16 people. It's stranger than fiction a lot of times, and that gets eyes on the TV rather than just talking about boring news. In the old days, they did have these talking heads where you would turn on the news and there would be an old dude up there talking with a little box over his shoulder, and he would just report the news. Well, when that was the only thing on broadcast TV you watched, because TV was mesmerizing. But now we have infinitely more options, and you're going to turn to something else unless they are able to keep you watching and entertain you. So, and another issue is that our media is private. You go to other countries, and other liberal democracies for that matter, government runs the news agencies. And so, in some countries like the United Kingdom, they have been able to have government-owned media, and at the same time allow it to be a medium for people to discuss ideas without fear of the government coming after them if you criticize them. But in most countries where you do have a government-run media, you don't really get to see it serve the agenda-setting function of the people. It becomes a tool of the government. It only works from the top down. And so, you go to places with authoritarian regimes, like in Russia, like in Iran, you've got the government using the media to propagandize the people, to indoctrinate them. And so, that's one of the privileges we have of a free press and a free media here in America. We take the good with the bad. We have the ability to criticize our politicians. This is a democracy, after all. And we take the bad with it. We may not get the full story. We may get a spun story in order to entertain us and keep us watching. Now, with that said, there is a degree of regulation of the media. It is private content, but it is monitored by the government. So since 1934, the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, has regulated TV, radio, and cable TV. And the purpose for this is to prevent monopolies. Um, when we watch programming on radio and TV, these networks, there's only a handful of these big conglomerate companies that own a lot of these companies. So, for example, Disney owns a ton of TV networks that you watch all the time. NBC owns a ton of these cable networks that you see. And so the FCC steps in and makes sure that there is fairness and that no one entity is taking over all the newscasts or all the networks, because then you would get only their message, and that would be problematic. And so, as kind of a free speech and also a free market thing, we have the government protecting against monopolies. So no one company can own more than 35% of a broadcast market. And they're serving the public interest, supposedly, and making it so that we have lots of different voices, which inevitably brings up an age-old topic of, should there be a fairness doctrine? And this is the idea that there should be fair time on every news network where all sides are discussed. And so if you go to ABC News or Fox News or even talk radio, Rush Limbaugh on talk radio, you would have to give equal treatment to the liberal perspective, the conservative perspective, or whatever other perspectives we define. And this has never really gone anywhere. There are people who have sour grapes and don't have enough airtime. They would complain about the fact that we should have a fairness doctrine. But it's got major free speech issues with that. And we have a free market as well. You choose to listen and watch any network that you choose. And if we're being spoon-fed certain perspectives, and we don't really have a choice about what those perspectives are, then we got free speech and free market issues. Finding the news is another big issue that we need to mention. Now, knowing that they have to entertain their viewers or listeners, the news has always got beats to follow, which is to say that they have reporters and cameras at certain locations that always generate big news stories. And so every single major news organization's got reporters and cameras at the White House at all times, at the Pentagon at all times, at Wall Street at all times. And then sometimes they're sifting out news and inventing news, and sometimes they're waiting for the next big story to break. Politicians also are going to create news sometimes with trial balloons. Trial balloon is when we always hear about leaks, from coming from the White House or coming from the Pentagon, or even companies will leak. And these are intentional leaks because they're trying to take a pulse of the public on a certain issue. So if you're the White House and you are maybe planning a big treaty with Russia, you might leak a little bit of information about Russia that's kind of related to the potential treaty and see how the people react, to kind of get a litmus test on how people will react to the bigger issue. Sometimes we have a phenomenon called wagging the dog, which is where the media is used to divert attention from something else. And so, back in the Clinton era, we had an example when Clinton was being hounded about his affair with a White House intern. He launched bombings of Iraq under the guise of Saddam Hussein violating some UN treaty, which he may have done legitimately, but he definitely was welcoming a change in the focus of the news that day. And politicians and governments have become very good at wagging the dog, and doing something or making something divert attention from something that is troubling to them. And we talked about investigative reporting, trying to, again, entertain the people and come up with the next big story. So reporters during the Iraq War or following some kind of scandals or smear campaigns are very common in the media today, where news agencies are trying to smear politicians and come up with some gunk on them in order to entertain their viewers. Presenting the news, this is some stuff that we've already kind of talked about, but entertainment over information. Sound bites used to be something that were much longer. They used to show 30-second clips of speeches and things, and people just don't have the patience for that anymore. So now they're down to 10 seconds or 5 seconds. And that, on the one hand, I guess it's concise, but on the other hand, we have an explosion of things being taken out of context. And a lot of times smear campaigns are launched on people because of these comments being taken out of context. And sometimes they'll allege that they were taken out of context when they really weren't. But it kind of speaks to our generation of low attention spans or short attention spans. Body watches are very common these days, especially with the President of the United States. The media always has a camera on big name people, and this is true of the entertainment industry too. Whoever the hottest actor or the hottest musician or biggest athlete of the day, and also politicians, there's always a camera on them to notify the public of what's going on that day, because people want to know about these people, but also looking for scandals. If you've always got a camera on them, whether they know it or not, by the way, there's a chance that you can unleash the next big scandal, and then your viewership or listeners just go through the roof. So talking heads, I mentioned before, they are very boring. We cannot stand these days watching the news with a person's face on the screen for more than a couple of seconds. And that's why when you're watching the news, they'll have multiple people on the screen as much as possible, so they can keep flipping the screen back and forth from one person to the next. Or if it's a news story, they can bounce to news footage or camera footage of the event, and then you have your on-location reporter, and then back to the studio, and then a follow-up question to the on-location reporter, and then they show an interview with somebody who witnessed the event. All this is addressing the issue that people get bored so easy these days because our attention spans are so short. As far as who gets the news, the president now receives about 60% of the exposure. Just about every night on national news, the president gets the main story. Congress gets about 37%, and the Supreme Court only 3%. And that 3% only comes out when there's a major Supreme Court decision, or a vacancy comes out, when somebody resigns, and then the whole process of filling that seat by the president, and then the confirmation hearings. So that little tiny 3% comes in bursts. You either never hear about the Supreme Court, and then every now and then, with a big case or the seat opening up, then you'll hear about them, which is really kind of unfortunate, because the Supreme Court these days plays such a huge role, as we'll see down the road. They're definitely worthy of more than 3% of the attention. Lastly, bias in the news. A study in 2002 found that 37% of journalists called themselves Democrats, while only 19% called themselves Republican. We could look at ideology numbers here, and they would be far more staggering. You have to understand, in a study like this, journalists are going to be a little skeptical about affiliating themselves with one side or the other. Now, everybody is on one side or the other, but you don't necessarily want to see that, because they want to perpetuate this idea that they're impartial. So if we're being honest with ourselves, and these are just kind of some up in the air projections by me, I would say that at least 2/3 of journalists these days are liberals, and maybe only a third or less are going to be conservatives. And the reason is because the universities these days are dominated by liberals, and they're churning out liberal journalists most of the time. And so that's why there's a disproportionate amount of liberal media in the news today. So whenever you hear the term mainstream media, that basically is a euphemism for the liberal media. And some of the media is just outright liberal without even trying to hide it. And so, as we said, the whole thing comes down to that the news agencies play for a team as well. And they're trying to spin the news to support a certain ideological slant. So liberal news media is going to present the news in a way that the liberals are going to like. They need to keep their liberal viewers watching, and they need to explain to them the talking points of the day, what they should say to their coworkers when talking about politics, so that they can go out and talk about the issues intelligently to help their team win elections. Same thing for conservatives working the other way. And so there's some very clear patterns that it doesn't take a genius to see. By and large, broadcast media and cable news are all liberal, some of them more than others. The broadcast media is going to be pretty close to the middle, but definitely slant left. And then MSNBC and CNN are going to be very clearly liberal. The only exception to this is Fox News, which clearly slants to the Republican side or to the conservative side. Major metropolitan newspapers are going to be very liberal, and that's pretty consistent. You're going to be hard-pressed to find a newspaper that's conservative, even in conservative areas, say in the South, like Atlanta, or even Dallas or Houston, which are going to be conservative regions. You're still going to find pretty liberal newspapers. Talk radio is almost universally conservative, at least the big-time shows that anybody knows about. So Rush Limbaugh is an incredibly influential figure for the conservative cause. There are a few others that you could mention as well. And then everybody else is kind of pick your poison. So you got the internet, you got magazines. Basically, all the rest of it is going to be narrowcasted to certain kinds of people, and then they're going to try to help their side. So there's conservative news internet sites that are going to try to entertain conservative readers, give them the talking points, smear the other side, and try to help the conservative cause win the day. Same thing with Democratic or left-leaning magazines. They're going to mobilize their people, entertain them so they'll read, and then instruct them on how to talk about the issues. They're going to expose news and slant it as to hurt their opponents and help them those that they're for. And so, the bottom line is the media, it serves an important function by telling us what's going on and forcing the politicians to address these things. But never forget that they are biased and that first and foremost they got to make money, so they are trying to entertain